Hello and welcome to Unit 4, Day 2. Today's aim is through which process do materials move across a cell membrane? And we're going to be speaking primarily today about the process by which materials move across a cell membrane without energy, passive transport, which you may know as diffusion. So let's go ahead and get started. All right. So, passive transport, or how do materials move through the cell membrane without an input of energy? And again, another word for passive transport is diffusion. So, let's take a look at the process of diffusion. You can see here the dye is dropped into a cup of water. So this is food dye and it's being dropped in. And at first, the food dye is only right in one spot. And then as you can see in the next image, the food dye has begun to spread throughout the cup. So that can also happen, obviously, if you're mixing up like some iced tea or some Kool-Aid, right? You might do that and you will see the color change slowly. At first, just where you put the powder, and then it will become evenly distributed throughout the water to become one homogeneous mixture. And as you can see, this is happening, as we can see with our eyes, because it's dye, but it's also happening at the molecular level, that the particles are becoming evenly distributed. You can see the dye molecules and the water molecules are separating out until they become equal throughout the cup, throughout the area that they are in, right? And diffusion is how a lot of materials, molecules move, particularly gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide. We're going to talk later about the passive transport of water, which is called osmosis. So let's go ahead and before we do part A, go on to the do now question. All right, so our aim, through which process do materials move across a cell membrane? And we remember from day one, right, the function of the cell membrane is it controls what goes in and out of the cell, and it makes the outside of the cell. And we're talking about here diffusion. Right, and we've heard of this process of diffusion before, but it's very important to our bodies. So, the do now. Scientists have found that although plants require light to carry on photosynthesis, very high levels of sunlight kill some plants. This illustrates that many biochemical processes may occur within a specific range of conditions, right? So, like homeostasis, we want to maintain a stable internal environment. We want to maintain balance. And that is critical if you think about like an enzyme, for example, right? The optimum pH or the optimum temperature. In any case, humans also function that way, right? Not only do proteins within our bodies function that way, but we function that way, right? Aren't you the most comfortable in not sweating between like what, 60 and 70 degrees? That temperature range is Fahrenheit. That temperature range is the most ideal, optimum temperature for humans. And so that is the answer. Let's go on to part A, passive transport. In a solution, randomly moving molecules tend to fill up a space. When the space is filled evenly, a state called equilibrium is reached. And equilibrium means right, balance throughout the solution, like we saw in that image. When you add dye to the cup at the end, when the dye is evenly distributed throughout, that's equilibrium. The amount of a particular substance, solute, so in the example with the dye and the water, the solute was dye, and the solvent is water. And the thing together, the solute plus the solvent, is the solution. So a solution just usually means a liquid mixture, right? But when we're referring to parts of a solution, and this is really more chemistry than living environment, but the solute is what is dissolved, like salt is a solute, and water is the solvent. And water is not just the solvent, but it is the universal solvent. Water dissolves almost everything. Thanks, water. So this next statement is the whole shebang here. Okay, so molecules will generally move from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. So that looks like this. Right, we have a bunch of molecules over here. Let's say it's COVID, right? So you sneezed. And so you sneezed, you released all the particles in this one part of the room. Well, what'll happen is the molecules of COVID will move from an area of high concentration where you sneezed all throughout a room until they are distributed more evenly. And this is why you have to wear your masks, folks. Critical. So this movement down the concentration gradient, and that's another important term. So the concentration gradient is, a gradient color pattern, right? Like it goes kind of like this little color palette here, right? That it goes from light to dark, like changing. That's the concentration gradient, going from the area of high concentration to the area of low concentration. So this, for example, here is the concentration gradient. It's darker there, and then it gets lighter. Right, so that's the concentration gradient. I hope that what looks like a splotch makes sense, right? But this is high concentration, it's darker, to lower concentration, that's the concentration gradient. Okay, so this movement down the concentration gradient, so when it happens in this way, from high concentration to low concentration, it is called passive transport. Or diffusion, and it does not require energy. Although many molecules can easily diffuse across the semi-permeable membrane, cell membrane, semi-permeable, only allows some things to cross. Some molecules are too large or too strongly charged ions to cross the lipid bilayer and instead diffuse through the transport proteins found within the lipid bilayer. So that's why, talking about that fluid mosaic model of the cell membrane, there are transport proteins embedded within the phospholipid bilayer that allow some molecules, for example, sodium and potassium ions, to pass through those channels. Okay, so what is passive transport? Passive transport is movement of molecules along down concentration gradient. So from high to low. And I'm stealing this metaphor from Hank Green, but it's like you go into a concert. Remember concerts before COVID? You go into a concert, right? And everyone starts close to the front of the stage, right? You all like rush towards the stage. And then as the show progresses, usually people back up a little bit and spread out. And that is sort of how diffusion works, right? Initially, when you drop the dye into the cup, it's concentrated in one area. That's the area of high concentration. And then it spreads out until it reaches equilibrium and is evenly distributed throughout the solution. So does passive transport require energy? No, it does not. Because diffusion depends upon random particle movements, substances diffuse across membranes without the use of energy, at which point will the movement of these particles cease when equilibrium is reached. So when there's no more concentration gradient. So once it's equal on both sides, let's draw that out. Once it's equal on both sides, then that's equilibrium. No more movement occurs. But at first, let's say tool. At first, let's say it's like this. Right? The movement is going to continue to occur in that direction, but then once it's equal on both sides, no more movement occurs, and this is equilibrium. That is equilibrium when it's equal on both sides. Okay. Suppose a molecule is present in unequal concentrations on either side of a cell membrane, which happens all the time, right? So here's our little cell membrane. Let's say inside the cell, we have a lot of potassium. Outside the cell, we only have a little potassium. If the substance is small enough to cross the cell membrane, in which direction do you think the molecules will move? Support your answer. So if it is able to pass through the semi-permeable cell membrane, molecules will move along concentration gradient from high to low until equilibrium is reached. Because that, ladies and gentlemen, ooh, forgive me for that handwriting, because that is how diffusion works. And this image illustrates the point when it stops, and that's equilibrium right there. And that is how movement of molecules works. All right, so today, our aim was through which process do materials move across a cell membrane? And the short answer is diffusion. All right, ladies and gentlemen, please go ahead and complete your exit ticket. Go ahead and submit your guided notes. Have a super fantastic day, and I'll see you all tomorrow on Zoom. Bye, guys.